Welcome to the London Centre for Policy Research and our Thought to Action series of video interviews and podcasts. My name's Tim Wilson. If you like what we do, please follow us on our website at londoncentre.org, or even better, support us by becoming a Patreon follower. And we are available on Patreon at, again, Thought to Action. With me today is Professor Dr. Stephen Halbrook. He's a lawyer, he's a philosopher and a historian, and he has recently he's done a huge amount of work on the Second Amendment, and he has recently written a new book, which I've just enjoyed very much reading, The Right to Bear Arms, which is a history of, right up to the present day, of the Second Amendment. Stephen, welcome.
Glad to be on the show, Tim. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Would you like to describe why you wrote the book and roughly what it covers? You'll do a better job than I will.
Well, I've been working on this Second Amendment issue since I was pretty young. I discovered very early on that this was kind of the part of the Bill of Rights that's kept in the closet. People didn't tend to like it back in the late 60s, early 70s. And so, because they wanted to pass all kinds of firearm restrictions. And so the argument was invented that the Second Amendment right of the people to keep and bear arms is only a collective right that state militias have. And so my earlier writings had to do with that topic, the individual right versus collective right, so-called. And once we got past that, when the Supreme Court in the Heller versus DC case held it to be an individual right, and 2 years later, McDonald, that it applies to the states. The next really big issue was whether you have a right to bear arms outside your home. And you would think so. The right of the people to keep and bear arms. Surely they weren't conceiving that you can take a gun from your kitchen to your dining room, for example. It's got to be something more than that.
Yep.
And so that's one of my areas of focus in recent years. And the Supreme Court at the end of last term denied cert petitions to take cases on that issue. But in the meantime, I've been working on this book for actually several years. And just by coincidence, about 6 weeks ago or so, the book came out on a Friday, and then the Supreme Court announced on Monday that they're going to hear a case on the very same issue that the book is about.
Yep.
So, and the book is mostly historical, but of course it starts with the language of the amendment. And I say in the book, you would think that nobody would need to write a book about this, that you have a right to bear arms. And of course, there's no restriction that it must be only in your home. And then it goes through the English history, early American history, and then on up to modern times. So that's basically the book in a nutshell, but it was very timely that it came out right when the Supreme Court said they're going to take this case. It's called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Corlett. It has to do with the fact that in the state of New York, you can only get a gun carry permit if you're somebody really special, somebody in the elite. That's why the subtitle of my book, by the way, is A Constitutional Right of the People or a Privilege of the Ruling Class.
Yep.
And unless you're a celebrity, a billionaire, politically connected, or if you are pay the right bribes, you don't get a carry permit in New York.
Well, let me just jump in there and say I'm actually in New York and I have a carry permit, but I'm not in New York City,
right,
where specifically it is almost impossible to get a gun. And interestingly, my state permit does not allow me to carry into the 5 counties of Manhattan, the Manhattan area. And boy, is that frustrating. And then you go on to talk about national reciprocity and what have you. And driver's licenses are accepted everywhere. So why aren't carry permits accepted everywhere? It makes no sense. And that is what I love about your book and your writings. You do actually write very clearly. And as you started off by saying, the framers laid it out in what to me is clear, plain, simple, and short, concise English. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And yet, constantly there is this it feels like an ever increasing pressure to infringe those rights.
Yeah, and one thing about New York law, it says that the authorities may issue a permit to carry
Yep.
if you show good cause.
Yep.
And so there are jurisdictions like New York City where it's never good enough. You live in a high crime neighborhood. Well, so does everybody else in that neighborhood. You're nobody special. You don't get a permit.
Yep.
And of course, in upstate, there's issuing authorities with some common sense and respect for constitutional rights, and they do issue the carry permits.
Absolutely. That is exactly what goes on. I'm very lucky. I have a good sheriff. I have a reason for family reasons. One of my family members is potentially at higher risk of serious threat from other people. So, and how shall I put this? You don't get much better trained than somebody like me with 30 years in the military, albeit the British military, but special forces background training as well. So I am not a threat to society as a whole, which we'll come back to the book, but that kind of leads me to the overall thesis that I have anyway, which is that the Second Amendment is there because the American citizen can be trusted. And this is actually a pretty safe country in many ways. You wouldn't think so from the media. You wouldn't think so from the current administration and the president, who talk about an epidemic of gun violence. And yet what we see is that the latest tragedy in San Jose took place in a gun-free zone. Your thoughts on that?
Not only a gun-free zone, but in a state with some of the most restrictions that you can think of. And look how ridiculous these restrictions are, by the way. They don't stop any kind of crime, besides it being a gun-free zone, which criminals ignore every time. They have these restrictions like the gun has to be on the not unsafe roster. Many modern designs are ineligible to be sold in California because they don't meet some kind of criteria.
Yeah.
But the police are exempt from that, and so they can have unsafe guns, so-called, because everybody knows there's nothing wrong with these guns. Or you've got the waiting period, and you've got the registration and licensing, and just one thing after another.
Magazine limits, that didn't apply to this murderer.
Right. I mean, so what we're talking about, and there's two lines of thought here. The focus should be on the restrictions on criminals and criminal violence versus do we restrict law-abiding people? And of course, California has a reputation for treating criminals nice and letting people out early and no bond and all that.
Yep.
And for coming down and repressing law-abiding people. And so once again, this is just another lesson in how these kinds of restrictions don't work.
If I can just make the point as well about the gun-free zones, there is a great tell about how effective gun-free zones are from a survey that was done in Britain and over here about home invasion burglaries. In the UK, burglars who were caught and in jail were asked a questionnaire, and we're talking thousands of them, and responded that they actually preferred over their home invasions where somebody is home are about 70%, almost 70% of burglaries. Over here, it's less than 30%. It's somewhere down around 20%. And the British burglars, when they were questioned, admitted that they preferred people to be at home because it meant that they could almost certainly get the contents of wallets and pocketbooks and the like, and there was no physical threat to them. Over here, the same survey was done, and the felons in jail admitted that they didn't like to burgle a home when there was somebody home because they might get shot.
Right. And talking about UK, if I can make a comment, historically, in medieval times, there were restrictions because you had more absolute rule by the king. But as of the Declaration of Rights of 1689, you have recognition for the right of Protestants at that point to have arms for their defense and security. And you end up with a pretty robust right to carry. And by the time of the 1870 gun law, you had to get a license to carry, and you got it by paying a small fee at the post office.
Yep.
And there was no further requirement. You just had to pay that, and it was like a small tax, like a dog tax.
Yep.
And that was on the books until 1920. at which time you had to have some special reason and get permission. And then in the 80s and 90s, you have the handgun ban. And so what happens now in UK is they punish, if you're a homeowner and use a gun to protect your home from burglars, you go to jail and the burglars go free.
Yeah.
And by contrast, in America, we took that right of Protestants to have arms. We made it applicable to everybody as of the end of the Civil War, including former slaves. And everybody has that right. And so what we're dealing with now is, does everybody have a right to bear arms, not just to keep arms? And how many restrictions are going to be there? And so what happens, you have this, as I said, up until the Heller case in 2008, you had lower courts saying that, well, this is a collective right, nobody has this right, and so they could basically preempt any kind of challenge to any kind of gun law. But now that it's clear it's an individual right, and the court in that case relied on historical origins as well as the text. So now you have the other side trying to go back, way back in history, and to claim that the 1328 Statute of Northampton in the reign of Edward III,
Yeah.
that supersedes the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
There's no right to bear arms because we've got this long historical tradition of regulation. You
Well,
can't
again,
carry without the king's license. That's the argument.
again, I love the way you wrote that in the book. You pulled out a great quote where one of the justices involved turns around and says, I think it was a state justice, turns around and says, "You're pulling out needles from a legal haystack." There is a ton of evidence, as you say, on the other side. On the historical side, one note I picked out of your book with real interest was that there's a kind of implication in it from the early history that potentially the British caused themselves the Irish problem, as it became known for a long time, by banning Irish Catholics from having guns. And that was actually the reasoning behind the 1920 restrictions that came in, was that they were worried by the Irish freedom movement. And it always seems to be that the authorities become worried by a movement and use that as justification to clamp down on law-abiding citizens having guns.
Right. I mean, the 1920 law, you had the end of World War I, and all these soldiers coming back, and some of them brought guns, and then you have these colonial movements for independence. And, you have the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks and all that stuff. And so you have this alarm that, oh, we've got to do something, and we don't want law-abiding people. I mean, the focus was totally wrong. If you think there's anarchists with bombs going to be throwing bombs, then do something about that. But you don't have to disarm everybody. And in fact, there was a pretty robust right to carry arms in the UK up until 1920. Yep. And what you also had, though, was because of the longstanding Catholic Protestant feuds, which related to the conflict between France and England, for example. You have the disarming of Irish Catholics after William and Mary won in the battles in Ireland, and thereafter, instead of trying to make peace and accord Irish Catholics the same rights as other Englishmen, they were deprived of all kinds of rights, property and education, all kinds of things, right to have arms. And so then you have conflict for century after century.
Indeed. And it gets, I could talk about a lot more of this with you, but I want to move on just a little bit, because you also cover what I would call the early American era. And again, you come up with some wonderful examples of just how selective application of the law doesn't work to the benefit of everybody. And it does seem very much to me that one of the great things we have in Western democracies is the rule of law. The problems really start to grow when those laws are not applied equitably to everybody and freedoms are impinged. And freedoms are, what we regard as the most important aspect of life in a Western society. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And, when we had the war for independence, you had the attempts to disarm the colonists leading up to that. And the colonists relied on what they called the rights of Englishmen.
Yep.
And they quoted Sir William Blackstone and others who famously described that right in detail. And they weren't trying to do anything radical. They were wanting to get the same rights as everybody else. And they ended up, though, going beyond the rights accorded to Englishmen by protecting all kinds of rights, the freedom of the press and the right to bear arms and whatnot. And we had one deficiency, which was slavery. And so, and also you had the restrictions on even free blacks having arms, and they had to get permits or licenses to carry arms. And then we finally ended up doing away with that with the 13th and 14th Amendments. Slavery was abolished, and finally you had recognition that African Americans have the same rights as others. And so now we're down to the issue of, well, does everybody have rights? Can authorities just, pick and choose those who they want to accord the right to bear arms? Do you give permits to the people who contributed to the sheriff's election? Do you give a permit only to those who, the celebrities that are so famous and so important, and the billionaires and whatnot? And they had this big scandal 3 or 4 years ago in New York City where people were paying bribes to get gun permits. So having restrictions of that type just, promotes that kind of corruption. And so what we need to have is a society where the rights of all are given due recognition. And then these rights are important. The right to bear arms. They used to say when seconds count, the police are minutes away. And now in these cities where we've had the riots and looting and arson, you call 911 and they say, well, nobody's coming because the police have orders to stand down.
But so you're not allowed to protect yourself, even if you have got a permit, because you'll end up like the McCloskeys, in so much legal trouble. It seems as if the right to self-defense has gone away.
Right. And we had to depend on a juvenile in Kenosha, Wisconsin to try to prevent arson. And then they attack him. They're going to kill him. He shoots one of them and tries to run away. He shoots 2 more when they're trying to kill him. And I mean, the police were down the street just standing around.
Yep.
I mean, the McCloskeys in St. Louis, all they were doing was standing outside their house, and these rioters were going by and making threats to them. What are they supposed to do? They exhibited firearms, and now they're being prosecuted.
If I may as well now, just to bring it up right up to modern times, one of the great benefits to me of the United States is this business of it being a federation of United States. And that makes it a laboratory. We now have a real mix of gun laws across and gun control measures across those states. And for years and years, and that to this day, the anti-gun lobby continues to say that if the restrictions are lifted, there will be murder and mayhem in the streets.
Oh, yeah.
We've seen those restrictions lifted in a whole variety of places. And we've also seen open carry appear across more states. And funnily enough, people aren't being killed left, right, and the murder rates have not gone up. If anything, I think they've gone down in those states. But what's your thoughts about the wilting Wendy's, who the very concept of, for example, open carry in New York City would have fainting fits all over the place?
Right. Look at it historically. At the time of the founding, when the Second Amendment was adopted, 1791, you could carry openly or concealed. There were no restrictions. Then we have, in a minority of southern states, basically, restrictions on concealed carry in the antebellum period. And it wasn't until the late 19th century, early 20th century, that concealed weapon prohibitions are enacted in the northern states, and it was required that you get a permit to carry. Open carry was still allowed up in New Jersey, of all places, until 1966, I believe it was. And in fact, open carry has been the rule in most states since the country was founded. I'm in Virginia. Jamestown was founded in 1607.
Yep.
Open carry is still legal here, and people don't do it that much. In modern times, it's more, it's considered more polite, or for whatever reason, to carry concealed. You don't alarm other people. And in fact, in New York State, there is no open carry license. There's only the concealed carry license that's going to be subject to Supreme Court review now.
Yeah.
So, I agree. There's some cultural issues in urban life where a lot of people would prefer people carry concealed and not openly. And there's no reason not to give that some weight. But on the other hand, you've got to allow carry it in some way, either openly or concealed. You can't just ban it all.
Stephen Halbrook, I could honestly sit and talk with you for hours, but I thoroughly commend to everybody your new book, The Right to Bear Arms. It is a good read. It is very readable. It is incredibly thorough, and it really does take you from almost the dark ages of England through the history of guns in the West, in Western society, right up to the modern day, including mention of the pandemic last year and the results of the various riots and people buying guns like crazy for their own protection. An American right.
Right.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed.
Oh, you're quite welcome, Tim. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Great pleasure. Thank you for watching Thought to Action by the London Centre for Policy Research. I'm Tim Wilson. This was fun to do. I hope you'll find most of our videos are fun to watch, if not all of them. Please follow it if you want more information on any of this or anything else to do with any of the topics that we cover. Please visit our website at londoncentre.org. And to support our projects, please join our Patreon community at Thought to Action. We're also on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, we're on it. We're on all the social media, and we're now doing these as audio podcasts as well. Thank you very much for watching. Please support us if you can.